Hey guys, it is time to start period 8 of the APUSH curriculum. This is going to carry us from 1945, the end of World War II, until 1980, which is going to be the year Ronald Reagan is elected. And this time period, although brief in terms of years, is really, really important in terms of how America is changing and evolving and becoming closer to the modern America that most of us are a little bit more familiar with. Now, this is also the last big historical period we cover in the APUSH curriculum. Period 9, which will be our final one, is basically 1980 to the present. It's a much shorter unit, so this is kind of the last big unit of the year. And today, what we're going to do is we're going to cover the first half of topic 8.2, which is the Cold War from 1945 to 1980. Now, I don't get to decide how the College Board sets up their curriculum. I think it's kind of crazy to have that much Cold War in just one single topic. There's just so much to go on here, but whatever. We'll do the best we can. What we're going to do actually is we're going to cut this into 2 videos because it's just so much information that to do it all in one would be probably a little overwhelming. So we're going to go up to about the Korean War in this first video, and then the second video will pick up right there. Alright, well, let's get into the Cold War and figure out why and how it changed America's relationship with the world. And obviously, if we want to talk Cold War, we want to talk about how America's relationship is changing with the world, we have to go back to World War II. And there had been tensions with the United States and the Soviet Union before the war. And then obviously during the war, we were kind of a marriage of convenience because we had the same enemy, that is to say Nazi Germany. But the fact that they were a communist country and communism and capitalism just doesn't mix means that even though we were friends sort of during the war, once that war is over, those tensions, those suspicions, that paranoia begins rising back to the surface. And, you know, we looked at the Soviet Union as this big growing monster that's spreading communism across Europe and also into Asia. Here's a pretty interesting map of sort of the Soviet sphere of influence in the red, and in the American sphere of influence in the green. And this is also interesting to think about from the northern perspective, you know, looking at the pole, just how close the United States and the Soviet Union really are. Most of us are thinking of a map typically where you're going kind of east and west, and the Soviet Union is a long way away. It's actually a lot closer to go right over the top, which is something we thought about a lot in the Cold War because, of course, the presence of nuclear weapons, whether that be delivered by bombers or by missiles, they would have gone over the North Pole to get to the targets more quickly. All right, well, let's talk about some reasons for tensions. Obviously, the first one is just the fact that we are a capitalist democratic society, and they were not. They were a communistic society, one built on a really an all-powerful government and really not a lot of freedom for the people. Now, in terms of World War II, this also brought about some specific tensions. The Soviets, and by which I mean really Stalin, had really convinced themselves that the Western Allies, that is to say America and Britain, had been dragging their feet and opening up that second front against the Nazis. From Stalin's perspective, he's thinking that since we don't like communists, we were basically kind of waiting around and letting the Nazis just beat up to the Soviet Union to the point where they're so weak that once the war is over, the Soviet Union will not be a threat. And so we were dragging our feet before we invaded Italy and then invaded France. Now, the Soviets were also ticked off that we had not shared our information on the Manhattan Project. So we had shared with the British that we were developing this nuclear weapon. We did not share that information with the Soviets, although the Soviets had spies and they were fully aware of what was going on, and they were kind of waiting around to see if we would tell them, and we did not, and that just from their perspective confirmed their suspicions that we were kind of out to get them. So Stalin comes out of this war with a desire to create this buffer zone of friendly communist governments in Eastern Europe to protect against a future invasion from the West that Russians were seeing as kind of inevitable. So from the Soviet perspective, this is kind of basically deserved, right? The Soviets had suffered literally tens of millions of deaths in World War II, and they deserved some sort of compensation and also protection by having this sphere of influence. From our perspective, however, this looked like a growing communist empire. That communism was slowly creeping across Europe and threatening our closest allies, places like France and Italy and Britain. Now, it's also important to remember that both sides saw their particular ideology as the best one, as is sort of like the perfect form, if you will. We believed capitalism, democracy was kind of like the perfect form of society, and that everyone else should kind of get on board and do the same thing. The communist countries felt the same way about their system, that communism was this utopia of equality, and you didn't have poverty, or so you were told anyways, under communism. And so they were quickly, both sides were looking to export that ideology, almost like a religion, send out the missionaries to convert the people to your way of life. And that brings, of course, that level of competition for new territories from both our side and theirs. All right, let's now look at Germany, because Germany may have lost World War II, but in their defeat came problems, and that was what to do exactly with Germany. So it was decided, kind of as a temporary measure anyways, to divide Germany into 4 Allied occupation zones. There would be a British zone, an American, French, and Soviet zones. The capital city of Berlin would also be subdivided the same way. There would be a French, American, and British zones right here, and then the Soviet zone of Berlin right there. So that was, again, meant to be more or less temporary, but a permanent solution was basically impossible to come by. And so what happens is the Soviets really lock down their side of Germany, and the Western Allies come to the conclusion that creating some sort of unified Germany going forward is going to be impossible. And so they go ahead and establish what's known as the Federal German Republic. That is to say, West Germany, right here. So in other words, we're going to take our 3 zones here, the British, the French, and the American zone, fuse them into one new country we're going to call West Germany. The Soviets followed suit by taking their occupation zone and creating East Germany, or the German Democratic Republic, as it's more officially known. This dividing of Germany is symbolic of the the larger division of Europe as a whole. The famous Iron Curtain that you might remember learning about in world history, the dividing line, the metaphorical dividing line between the eastern part of Europe where it's communist and the western part of Europe where it's capitalist and democratic. This line is going to define what the Cold War is all about. And you can see there's Churchill looking under the Iron Curtain. Now, Berlin was a curious case because Berlin itself, as we mentioned just a moment ago, was divided among the 4 winning allies. So that meant that even though this right over here had become a communist government allied with the Soviet Union, there was a little bit of America, Britain, and France right here. What we call this is West Berlin. And from Stalin's perspective, that was totally unacceptable. Having this little zone of democracy and capitalism in his sphere of influence was just a thorn in his side. And so in 1948, he decides to try to bully the Western Allies out of West Berlin. What the Soviets do is they cut off road, rail, and water access to West Berlin. So no boats, no railroads, no trucks, no nothing, right? Nothing overland is going from our zones over here into West Berlin. That only leaves one route, by air. And the Western Allies decide, we can still save West Berlin if we fly in everything needed to supply West Berlin. Now, Stalin didn't think this was possible. He felt that, there's no way this is sustainable over a long period. But for 11 months, that's exactly what the Western Allies do. They deliver thousands and thousands of tons of supply by air. And it is a huge propaganda victory for the West. It's an embarrassment for Stalin. He eventually has to back down. And it also helps America build allies with former enemies. I mean, there's a great irony of American planes flying over Berlin and being cheered, right? Just 3 years before this, an American plane over Berlin would have been a sign of danger, and people would have been running for the shelters, but now it's a sign of life. So as I said, Stalin backs down, the blockade is removed, and Stalin basically, is upset, but there's not much he can do about it. All right, now let's look at some actual foreign policy. So in 1947, a diplomat named George F. Kennan composed and sent what's known as the Long Telegram. And Kennan had been a Russian expert by experience and professional training and all that. And he had come to the conclusion that if you look at Russia, it's a country that is by nature expansionary. In other words, it wants to grow outward, but it's also very cautious. And if you stand up to them, they will stop. It's kind of like a bully. If you stand up to the bully, in theory, the bully will have to back down because the bully may not actually want to carry through his threats. So he called this firm and vigilant containment. Okay, so in other words, if we stand up to Soviet expansion and aggression, they will have no choice but to back down, and therefore we will contain the spread of communism across the globe. And this becomes known as the Truman Doctrine, this idea that we are going to help any so-called free people who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. In other words, if the Soviets are giving you trouble, America will send in aid to help stop the Soviets. And we do this at first with the countries of Greece and Turkey. Truman asks for $400 million to strengthen those two countries because Greece was in the middle of a civil war. The communist faction that was fighting this war was very strong, getting supplies, of course, from the Soviets. And the theory was that if Greece would fall to communism, Turkey would be next. And then after Turkey, Iran would go communist. And then, every other country around there would go communist. And so we had to stop it with Greece. All right, now let's look at the Marshall Plan. Very important topic, guys, as we head forward in the early Cold War. So Western Europe was still really digging out of the rubble after World War II. You had people who are living in dire poverty, living in rubble, living without running water and electricity. It's a pretty desperate situation, and there was a great fear that in their desperation, people might actually turn to communism or be willing to kind of step aside and let communism take over in their countries. And so we had to do something to prevent that from happening in the first place, which means giving U.S. aid to Europe. We call this Marshall Plan because of George C. Marshall, who was our Secretary of State at the time. He had also been the highest-ranking member of the military during World War II. So he answered only to Franklin Roosevelt, basically, and the chain of command back in World War II. So, again, the plan is we're going to help out Western Europeans. And, hey, we even offer this to Eastern Europeans as well. But Stalin forces Eastern Europeans to turn down our help because to accept our help would be to accept and admit that our system was working better than the Soviet system. All told, it's going to cost about $12.5 billion. And you can see on the map who gets what. France, Britain, Italy are getting a big chunk of money, Netherlands as well. But we're handing it out to pretty friendly just pretty generously. In fact, we're handing it out to countries that weren't even in World War II. Portugal, Sweden, Turkey, they weren't even in World War II, and we're giving out money to them. Same thing with Ireland. They weren't in World War II, and even they're getting money from us. So we are just throwing money around, and this turns out to be a big success for a couple of reasons. Number one, it helps turn around Western Europe and gets the Western European countries kind of jump-started again, economically speaking. In places like Germany, West Germany that is, the economy rebounds quickly and they become just a center of prosperity and trade. And, that's good because people who are prosperous in trading and having a good life are less likely to turn to people like Hitler or Stalin or something like that. So we like this. Prosperity equals peace in our minds. Also, with things improving quickly, the communist parties, that had really been gaining a lot of strength, particularly in France and Italy, begin to weaken. Now, they're not going to completely go away. There's still a communist party in Italy and France today, but their power was basically gone, because their whole message was turn to us, because, as you can see, democracy doesn't work. Well, once America steps in and helps Western Europe, that message rings hollow. All right, now let's get into the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, better known as NATO. Now, you might recall way back in our early days of this class, we learned that George Washington had given a farewell address, and he had urged Americans to avoid permanent alliances, right? We're not going to do this whole permanent alliance thing. Well, that is something we're going to turn our backs on after World War II. So in 1949, the NATO treaty was signed, and the way this works is any member of NATO, if they are attacked, can call on all the rest of the members to help defend them. So an attack on one is an attack on all. This is we known as collective security. The theory behind this is this will make Stalin think twice about attacking any of the countries in Western Europe, because if they do, they know they have to answer to a whole bunch of other countries. And the original members here are in dark blue. This would also include off-map Canada and the United States. And then over the years, this NATO alliance has expanded eastward. And this is a perfect complement to the idea of containment, right? We're going to contain Soviet aggression by building an alliance with the people of Western Europe and Central Europe, and they will know we have their backs, they have our backs, and the Soviets will basically be forced to just kind of sit behind their borders and not expand outward any further. All right, so we're going to pick up in our next video, guys, with the Korean War, and then we'll finish up the Cold War.